I'm so sorry that I'm not actually with you in person. The only thing I can say for this is that it's saving on carbon. It's a pleasure to get to be with you in spirit and to be able to tell you, and this is going to be one of the themes that I'm going to talk about today, just how many people there are with you in spirit all over the world doing this same work. Your colleagues and your comrades everywhere. Where to start? Maybe to get it over with, the bad news, the kind of science update, where we are right now. I know you all know all that there is to know about climate change. We might as well be right up to date on the same page in the same place. Each passing week, the news from the natural world gets a little bit grimmer. We've learned in the last 6 weeks or so that we've just come through the 12 warmest months on record, according to NASA, and that 2010 will almost certainly be the warmest calendar year on record. We've seen that ice in the Arctic this summer is melting at a pace even ahead of the record summer of 2007, at least through the early part of the summer. We may be headed for a new record there. Maybe most of all, what we've seen in the last 6 months around the world is the really enormous disruptions to hydrological cycles that scientists have been predicting for a very, very long time. And those disruptions come because, and come to think of it, this may be the most important physical fact of the century, they come because warm air holds more water vapor than cold air does. And that means that in dry places we get increased evaporation. But in wet places, that water that's up there in the atmosphere is coming down in record amounts, coming down because the atmosphere is 5% moister than it was 40 years ago, an astonishing change in a basic physical parameter of the planet. That flooding, which seems to happen now someplace almost every day in the world, is astonishing to see when you really start to think about how much water is coming down. In my country, we saw in early May the worst flooding in Tennessee, around Nashville. They called it the 1,000-year storm. A couple of weeks later, it was Oklahoma City, 10 inches of rain in 3 hours. In between that was Guatemala and the tropical islands, where the first tropical storm of the year, Agatha, dropped a record amount of rain. There's wicked flooding underway in China and along the Burmese border, killing people by the thousands. That kind of disruption is precisely what we can expect going forward, more and more and more of it. Even just the raw temperature is getting so high that it's very, very difficult for people to deal with it. We were talking with our 350.org allies in the Asian subcontinent a couple of weeks ago. These are not places where people complain much about the heat because it's always hot. But they were complaining when we talked to them. India was enduring the worst heat wave since the British started keeping records 200 years ago. In Pakistan, they set, on the day that we were speaking with them on the phone, the all-time Asia record for heat, 53.5 degrees centigrade. You'll forgive me as an American for my Celsius inabilities, 129 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale. That's almost hotter than I can even quite imagine. All of that disruption, and this is important, is happening with a temperature increase of about 1 degree globally averaged. Now, when I wrote the first book about climate change 21 years ago, a book called The End of Nature, we wouldn't have said that 1 degree would be enough to do all this. We thought that big change was probably a few more degrees and hence a few more decades down the road. But it turns out that we underestimated just how finely balanced the planet was. 1 degree, which is about 2 watts per square meter of the Earth's surface of extrasolar energy, has been enough to set off this kind of chaos in every physical system we can name. It is a profound, powerful shift and it's happening very quickly. And here's the scary part. We've raised the temperature 1 degree. Science is very clear that we've already put enough carbon in the atmosphere to guarantee us another degree already. But they're also, the climatologists, completely convinced, consensus, that unless we make the shift to renewable energy from fossil fuel far more rapidly than political and economic systems are currently planning, that we will see a temperature increase of 5 or 6 or 7 degrees in the course of this century. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we do not want to find out what 5 degrees does. But that is very much what we are facing, and facing right away. The other part of the problem, of course, is that the impacts are coming already, and they're coming in the places that have done the least to cause this problem. Last year, the first real attempt at a study on worldwide effects of climate change showed that about 300,000 people annually were already dying from those effects. I got some sense of what that looked like 5 or 6 years ago in Bangladesh, when they were having the first big outbreak of a disease called dengue fever. I was over there and I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so eventually I got bit by the wrong mosquito myself, came down with it. I was sick, but I didn't die. I was strong and healthy going in. Lots and lots of people did die. They're dying all over the world. The incidence of dengue is up 200% in the course of the last decade. And what makes it not just horrible, but morally repugnant, is that they've done nothing to contribute to this problem. When the UN tries to measure how much carbon each nation emits, you can't even get a number for a place like Bangladesh. It's a rounding error in the calculations. The US, the 4% of us who live in my country produce 25% of the world's CO2. If 100 people keel over dead from dengue fever, 25 of them are our responsibility. So the question becomes, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to deal with it in the US, in Canada, in Britain, in Australia, in Western Europe, in Japan, in the developed world, and increasingly in the developing world, in countries like China that are pouring lots of carbon into the atmosphere? And here's where I'm going to start sharing with you good news instead of bad. The first answer to that question, how we're going to deal with it, is by making useful technological change. Change that's now far easier to see where it might come from than it was just a little while ago. When environmentalists gave talks about renewable energy 25 years ago, we did it with our fingers crossed because, solar energy and wind power and things, they weren't quite ready for prime time yet. They were still hard to do. They were marginal. They were on the fringe. That's no longer the case. Wind power is the fastest growing source of electric generation around the world. Its cost is dropping constantly. Solar photovoltaics are increasingly in use. Much more so the solar thermal, the solar hot water. I was in China a couple of weeks ago with the head of the Hemin company, which alone, just one company, has managed to put solar hot water heaters on the roofs of 60 million Chinese homes. 250 million Chinese heat their hot water with the sunlight that falls on their shingles. That's half the renewable capacity of all kinds around the world, and it's really remarkable to see. The technology is there. At least some of it, at least what we need to get started, the technology of efficiency and of conservation that we've barely begun to exploit. What we're missing is not the technology. What we're missing is the political will to put that technology to work fast enough to matter, to spread it with the speed that it needs spreading. And that's a question that we can do something about. That's a question in the end of how much political will we can muster. That's within our power to affect. And that's what I want to talk about. And thank you for your help with in the past and enlist your help with more for the future. Because we're building around the world the kind of movement that really may be able to build that political will. And here I confess I move from the world of cold, hard statistics to a much more, a much more anecdotal world. Nobody knows with any precision how to build political movements, how to muster political will. Certainly I don't. This is not my life's work. I've spent most of my life as a writer, and writers aren't good at this kind of thing at all. We're self-selected for sitting in our rooms and typing, which is what I spent most of my life doing, until I figured out, and that trip to Bangladesh and watching those people die helped me figure it out, until I figured out that I needed to do more than just write, that I needed to figure out how to take some kind of role. Now, I confess, I had no idea what that would be. I'm a writer. I live in Vermont, which is the second smallest state in the United States. I live out in the woods. I didn't know how to affect events in the way that I wanted to. My first attempt, I called up all my other writer friends in Vermont. And I said, you know what, let's go up to our main city, which is Burlington. It's only about 50,000 people, but it's as good as we got. I said, we're going to go up there and we're going to sit in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll get arrested, and there'll be a story in the paper, and at least we will have done something. And all these other writers were as politically clueless as I was. They're, oh, that's a good plan, let's do that. Except that one of them called up to the police in Burlington and said, what'll happen if we pull off this intrepid stunt? And the police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, and we'll come visit you. So we had to recalibrate, and we sent out emails. And I just said to folks, come meet us, we're going to go for a walk. And we left a couple of weeks later, and we marched from the birthplace of the American poet Robert Frost up in his summer writing cabin up in the Green Mountains of Vermont. So we set off walking, and we walked for 5 days, and we slept in farm fields at night. We got to Burlington, and there were 1,000 people marching, which in Vermont's a lot of people. As many people as had ever been seen at something like this. Enough to get all of our candidates for federal office to come down and meet with us. And they didn't just meet with us, they signed on to this raggedy piece of cardboard that we had been carrying hither and yon that said that if they were elected, they'd work to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050, which at the time was a very radical doctrine. Only scientists supported it, not politicians, but all these guys signed on, even the very conservative Republicans. The woman who was running for Congress on the Republican ticket said 2 months earlier that she wasn't sure climate change was real and more research needed to be done. It turned out the more research that needed to be done was on the question, how many people were going to walk across Vermont and ask her to change her mind? So that was good to find out. The only bad thing was to open the newspaper the next morning and see a story that said that 1,000 people may have been the biggest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the U.S. This was 2006. When we saw that, we began to understand why we were losing, particularly in the United States, but even around the rest of the world, where there'd been more organizing, but nowhere near enough, where there wasn't a movement of the size or the scale necessary to, after all, take on the most profitable, powerful industry that the world has ever seen, the fossil fuel industry. They made more money last year. Exxon alone made more money last year than any company in the history of money. So it's no easy battle to do something that will disrupt their business model, that will fundamentally change the way the world works. Since we don't have the money to compete with them, then we're going to have to use some other currency, and that currency is our bodies and our spirit and our passion. We began in the U.S. trying to see if we could organize in that kind of way. When I say we, I mean me and 7 undergraduates at the college where I teach a little. And we started emailing people and asking them to we didn't have money or anything, but would they organize demonstrations and like the one we'd done? And indeed, 3 months later, in April of 2007, we managed to have 1,400 simultaneous demonstrations across the U.S., and it was beautiful, and it was even kind of effective because Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, a couple of days later, adopted this 80% by 2050 goal as part of their election candidate platforms when they were running for president in the primaries that spring. We were feeling pleased with ourselves, except that a few weeks later, in the summer of 2007, that's when the Arctic first really started to melt. And that's when I began to get calls from scientists I'd known for a quarter century who'd always been concerned, but now they were alarmed, frightened, and they kept saying, every system we look at is changing too fast. We're off the upper edge of the scale of what was predicted. Things are really spinning out of control. By the time that summer was over, we recognized two things. One, our old targets were out of date. What happens in 2050 is of less interest than what happens in 2020. Two, we began to understand that just like we're not going to deal with this one light bulb at a time, we're probably not going to deal with it just one country at a time either. If we're going to deal with it, it's going to be one planet at a time. But recognizing that and starting to think about planet-scale organizing was a pretty daunting thing. There's precious little of that kind of organizing that happens because the world is a big place, and figuring out how you're going to organize it is a hard task. Not least because people all over the world insist on speaking their own language, which makes it difficult to do what needs doing. That's why in January of 2008, we were both horrified and elated when our friend Jim Hansen, the greatest climatologist in the world, the NASA scientist, and his team put out a paper that finally put a number on climate change, the most important number in the world. They said that any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million was not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted. That's strong language. And it's stronger still when you know that we're already way past that 350. The air outside, wherever you are today, in Canada or in Australia or in the UK or in the South Pacific, the air holds 390 parts per million CO2, and it's going up about 2 parts per million a year. That's why the Arctic is melting. We're too high already. It is not a problem for anybody's grandchildren. It's a problem right now, a crisis right now. That was terrifying to read. But as organizers, it was also useful. It gave us something to work with, a number around which to rally. Now, campaigners, it must be said, don't normally pick wonky scientific data points as their rallying cry. But 350 had two real attractions. One, it allows us to tell politicians not just that we need action on global warming, but how much action we need. A lot. And two, it allows us to work across those language boundaries that thwart global consciousness, because 350 means the same thing wherever you are. Arabic numerals cross those language boundaries. And so we set to work. We still didn't have anything in the way of resources, but the 7 young people that I was working with had happily graduated from college, and therefore they were able to work on things full-time, which was good. We were going to take some full-time effort. 7 was the right number to start with because there are 7 continents. Each one took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet because it's kind of its own, continent. Off we set to organize, which in our case meant trying to just find people like ourselves all over the world. Some of them were environmentalists. Many of them were interested in agriculture, in human rights, in public health, in all the things that are called deeply into question as this planet begins to climatically disintegrate. We told them they told us, we told them that in order to get this number across, we were going to have to, on one day, all try to speak with as loud a voice as possible. So we picked a day in the fall of 2009, shortly before the Copenhagen summit, October the 24th, and that was going to be the day that we were going to take this number and spread it all over the world. We didn't know how well it was going to work, frankly, because we were working, on a shoestring. We completely rely on Skype, on, email, we didn't have lists of people, we didn't have headquarters, we're mostly, like me, volunteers, It was a shoestring operation. We gathered a few days before October 24th in New York to do the last-minute chores, write the press releases and things, but also just kind of wait for the returns to come in. We told people that they were to upload pictures of their events as soon as... I'll tell you a story that tells you a little bit about how we organize. We began to get a sense things were going to work on Wednesday or Thursday of that week when we got a phone call from two sisters, 18 and 19, in Ethiopia. Now, we'd organized these sort of climate training camps around the world for young people, in Turkey for Central Asia, in the Caribbean, in Johannesburg for people from around Africa, many of whom had never left their countries or been on an airplane, but they came and they did a great job. They understood instinctively about organizing, and they fanned back out across the continent and went to work. We didn't hear much from them because the internet's still pretty notional in much of Africa, but we got a call that Thursday from these sisters, from one of them, Lily, in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia. She kept saying, I'm so sorry, we have to jump the gun. We're going to have to do this today to get out ahead of the government. We know we're sort of not supposed to be doing this. We're going too early. We're really sorry. And we've got 15,000 people out in the street in Addis Ababa right now. We said, Lily, you've done good. Don't worry. And after that, it was like that all over the planet. For the next 36 hours, pictures were just pouring in from everywhere. From U.S. troops in Afghanistan who had made big 350 out of sandbags and said they were going to park their Humvee, from under the pyramids and under the Eiffel Tower and in front of the White House, but mostly from the poorest places in the world. There were 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries that weekend around this 350 number. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. Many of you took part, and we're incredibly grateful for it. I hope you will go to 350.org and look at some of the 25,000 pictures in the Flickr account so you can see what your colleagues and comrades look like. They are poor, black, brown, Asian, young, mostly, because that's what the world is, mostly, and they are all equally concerned about what the future is going to be like. 6 weeks later, we went to Copenhagen with all kinds of momentum, and we managed to convince 117 of the world's nations to sign on to that 350 target, which was pretty amazing. The problem is, of course, that they were the wrong 117 nations. They were the poorest and most vulnerable, not the richest and the most addicted. So we've still got lots and lots of work to do, and lots of movement to build, and lots of campaigning that has to take place. That's where we need your help. The next big day, October 10th, 10-10-10, no excuse for forgetting the day. We're having not this time a global political rally, but a global work party in countries all over the world. In fact, I think the back of my shirt happens to have the phrase "get to work" in a bunch of different languages. So people will be putting up solar panels and digging community gardens and laying out bike paths. Not because we think we're going to solve this one bike path at a time. We are not. We will begin to address it the day we get national and international legislation to change the price of carbon. But these things are good in and of themselves, and they send a pointed political message to our leaders. We're getting to work. What about you? If I can climb up on the roof of the school and hammer in a solar panel, you can climb up to the floor of the Senate and hammer out some legislation. Look, bottom line, end of story, no guarantee this will work. No guarantee anything will work. There are scientists who think we may have waited too long to get started. There are political scientists who think that the vested interests on the other side are just too large. But the best science indicates we still have a moment not to stop global warming, but to head it off. And the best political science knows that if we rally what we need to rally people all over the world, then we have a chance. So no guarantee it'll work, only the guarantee that we will fight as long and as hard as we possibly can. Thank you so much for being a part of that fight. It is a real honor to be working side by side with you, and I look forward to it down the road. Thank you.